The year was 1989, and the Berlin Wall had just fallen. For 40 years, Europe had been a continent divided, not merely by barbed wire and concrete, but by the deepest ideological fault line in modern history. On one side stood the liberal democracies of Western Europe, sheltered under the American security umbrella of NATO. On the other, the satellite states of the Soviet Union, held together by fear, ideology, and the constant threat of military intervention. When that wall came down on the night of November 9th, crowds wept in the streets of Berlin. People who had spent their entire lives in a divided city embraced strangers. The world watched in disbelief. But behind the celebrations, some of the most consequential diplomatic negotiations in post-war history were quietly taking place. Germany was to be reunified. That much was clear. But what would happen to the military status of the newly unified Germany? Would it remain in NATO? And if it did, what assurances would the Soviet Union receive about NATO's future behavior? James Baker, the United States Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush, flew to Moscow in February 1990 to meet with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The conversation that followed has been debated by historians, lawyers, and politicians ever since. According to declassified documents and the personal memoirs of those present, Baker told Gorbachev that if Germany joined NATO, the alliance would expand not 1 inch eastward. He said this not once, but several times during the meetings. Gorbachev, by his own later account, believed he had received a genuine political assurance. The problem, and it is a problem that would haunt European security for the next 3 decades, was that no written treaty was ever signed. Baker's words were a verbal assurance, not a legally binding commitment. Western officials would later argue that no formal promise had been made, that Baker's statement referred only to East German territory, and that the final documents governing German reunification, the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, signed in September 1990, made no mention of any such guarantee to the broader Soviet bloc. Gorbachev himself gave contradictory accounts over the years. In some interviews, he insisted the promise had been real. In others, he acknowledged that no written agreement had been made. What is not in dispute is that the expectation of restraint existed in Soviet minds, and that when NATO began expanding less than a decade later, Russian leaders would point back to these conversations as evidence of Western betrayal. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union itself was collapsing. By December 1991, Gorbachev had resigned and the USSR formally ceased to exist. 15 new independent states emerged from its ruins, among them Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the nations of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Russia, now led by Boris Yeltsin, was economically shattered, politically chaotic, and militarily humiliated. Its former empire had disintegrated within months. For the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, the collapse of the Soviet Union represented not just liberation, but a desperate window of opportunity. These nations had lived under Soviet domination since the end of World War II. They had seen Soviet tanks crush the Hungarian uprising in 1956, the Prague Spring in 1968, and the imposition of martial law in Poland in 1981. For them, the question of NATO membership was not an abstract geopolitical debate. It was existential. If the Soviet Union could reconstitute itself, or if Russia could reassert regional dominance, they needed a security guarantee that no Soviet-era promise had ever provided. NATO was the only structure that could offer that guarantee. The stage was set. The Cold War was over. The promises, written and unwritten, were already beginning to fray. And the nations of Eastern Europe were already knocking on the door of the Western Alliance, asking to be let in. In January 1994, at the NATO summit in Brussels, President Bill Clinton unveiled a program called the Partnership for Peace. It was, in diplomatic terms, a carefully worded compromise. The Eastern European nations wanted full membership. Russia wanted a guarantee that NATO would not expand at all. The Partnership for Peace offered neither. Instead, it created a framework for military cooperation between NATO and non-member states, without any explicit commitment to future membership. Russian officials were initially cautiously accepting. Yeltsin himself, at a summit in December 1994, suggested that Russia might even consider joining. But events on the ground were moving faster than diplomacy. In 1994, Russia launched a devastating military campaign in Chechnya, attempting to suppress a separatist movement in the small republic on its southern border. The campaign was brutal, characterized by indiscriminate bombing of the Chechen capital Grozny and widespread human rights abuses. Western governments condemned the operation. For Eastern European leaders, Chechnya was a stark reminder. Russian military power had not disappeared. It had simply been redirected. Poland's President Lech Walesa, the former Solidarity trade union leader who had helped bring down communism in his country, was among the most vocal advocates for NATO membership. He understood better than most Western leaders what it meant to live under the shadow of Russian power. In meetings with Clinton and European heads of state, he argued with quiet intensity that the window for integration was closing, that Russia's democratic moment might not last, and that Poland needed to be anchored to the West before that window shut. Clinton, facing pressure from both his Eastern European allies and a skeptical Russian government, ultimately came down in favor of expansion. The arguments were partly strategic. NATO expansion would stabilize post-communist democracies and prevent a security vacuum in Central Europe, and partly idealistic, rooted in the belief that democratic nations should have the right to choose their alliances. In 1996, during his re-election campaign, Clinton publicly endorsed NATO enlargement, framing it as part of a broader vision for a Europe whole, free, and at peace. The formal decision came at the Madrid summit in July 1997. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were invited to begin accession talks. All three nations had by then undertaken significant democratic and military reforms. They had restructured their armed forces, adopted civilian oversight of the military, and demonstrated a commitment to the rule of law. On March 12, 1999, just 12 days before NATO began its bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, all three nations formally became members of the alliance. Russia's reaction was furious. Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, who was on a transatlantic flight when he received news of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, famously ordered the plane to turn around in midair, canceling a scheduled visit to Washington. It was a theatrical gesture, but it captured something real. The sense in Moscow that the West was not a partner, but a rival, reshaping European security on its own terms without Russian consent. For the three new members, however, the moment was one of profound historical satisfaction. Polish Foreign Minister Bronislaw Giermek, speaking at the accession ceremony in Independence, Missouri, chosen for its symbolic resonance with Truman's post-war foreign policy, said that his country was finally rejoining the community of Western nations from which it had been forcibly separated. For Poles who remembered the Soviet invasion of 1939, the occupation, the forced communism, the decades of repression, this was not merely a security arrangement. It was a reckoning with history. The first wave of expansion had succeeded, but it would not be the last. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were watching closely, calculating their own window. And in Moscow, a new and more dangerous figure was rising to power. When Vladimir Putin became acting president of Russia on New Year's Eve 1999, few Western leaders understood what they were dealing with. He was presented as a pragmatic modernizer, a former KGB officer who understood power, but who also, in his early years, expressed interest in closer ties with Europe and even, in one famous remark, suggested Russia might someday consider joining NATO itself. George W. Bush, after meeting Putin in June 2001, famously said he had looked into the man's eyes and got a sense of his soul. The comment would later become a source of considerable embarrassment. But even as Putin was projecting a cooperative face to Western audiences, the internal logic of Russian foreign policy was hardening. Putin's rise had been enabled in part by the Second Chechen War, which he prosecuted with extraordinary ruthlessness. The bombing of apartment buildings in Russian cities, attacks officially blamed on Chechen terrorists, but later investigated by independent journalists who suggested possible FSB involvement, provided the political justification for a campaign that leveled Grozny and killed tens of thousands of civilians. The message to Russia's neighbors was unmistakable. The Kremlin was back, and it was willing to use overwhelming force. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940 under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Stalin and Hitler. They had lived under Soviet rule for 50 years, experienced mass deportations, the suppression of their languages and cultures, and the settlement of large Russian-speaking populations on their territory. When they regained independence in 1991, they moved with remarkable speed toward Western integration, applying for both NATO and European Union membership almost immediately. Russia strongly opposed Baltic NATO membership on the grounds that it would bring NATO forces to within a few hundred kilometers of St. Petersburg, Russia's second city. Moscow argued that the Baltic states had significant Russian-speaking minorities whose rights needed to be protected, a framing that implied Russia had a legitimate security interest in those countries' domestic affairs. Western governments largely dismissed this argument as a cover for great power interference in sovereign states. The September 11th attacks in 2001 temporarily shifted the geopolitical atmosphere. Putin was the first foreign leader to call Bush after the attacks, offering condolences and strategic cooperation. Russia provided intelligence assistance for the American campaign in Afghanistan and allowed the use of Central Asian airspace. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the post-Cold War antagonism might give way to a genuine security partnership. It did not. In November 2002, at the Prague summit, NATO issued invitations to 7 new members: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. All 7 formally joined the alliance in March 2004. The Baltic accession was particularly significant. For the first time, NATO had expanded into the territory of the former Soviet Union itself. Moscow viewed this as a fundamental crossing of a red line. Putin's public response was measured, but the internal trajectory of Russian policy shifted decisively. The Kremlin began investing in what Western analysts would later call hybrid warfare: influence operations, cyber attacks, energy leverage, and support for political movements in neighboring states that were sympathetic to Russian interests. In 2007, a dispute over the relocation of a Soviet-era war memorial in Tallinn, Estonia triggered a massive cyber attack on Estonian government websites, widely attributed to Russian actors, though Moscow denied involvement. It was one of the first large-scale cyber attacks on a sovereign state in history, and it occurred significantly against a NATO member. In April 2008, at the Bucharest summit, the question of Ukraine and Georgia came to a head. The United States, under Bush, pushed for offering both countries a membership action plan, the formal first step toward NATO membership. France and Germany, led by Sarkozy and Merkel respectively, blocked the proposal, arguing that the move would unnecessarily provoke Russia. The summit ended with a compromise. NATO issued a declaration stating that Ukraine and Georgia will become members, but without a timeline or a formal pathway. It was the worst of all possible outcomes. It antagonized Russia without actually protecting Ukraine or Georgia. Just 4 months later, in August 2008, Russian forces invaded Georgia, recognizing the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. The Bucharest Declaration had not deterred Russia. It had perhaps encouraged the conclusion in Moscow that the West was bluffing. In November 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych abruptly rejected an association agreement with the European Union that his government had spent years negotiating. The decision, made under intense pressure from Moscow, which had threatened economic retaliation if Ukraine moved closer to the EU, triggered the largest protests in Ukrainian history. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, in Kyiv, demanding European integration, an end to corruption, and eventually Yanukovych's resignation. The movement became known as the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity. In February 2014, after riot police killed scores of protesters, Yanukovych fled to Russia. Within days, unmarked soldiers in green uniforms, quickly nicknamed Little Green Men, began appearing across Crimea. They seized government buildings, communication infrastructure, and military bases with precision and speed. Russian officials denied involvement, though Putin later acknowledged that Russian special forces had been present. In March 2014, following a referendum condemned by most of the international community as illegal and coerced, Russia formally annexed Crimea, the first forcible annexation of European territory since World War II. Simultaneously, Russian-backed separatists seized government buildings in the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. A low-intensity conflict began that would kill over 14,000 people over the next 8 years. The Minsk agreements, brokered by France and Germany in 2014 and 2015, attempted to freeze the conflict without resolving its underlying causes. Russia insisted that Ukraine implement the agreements in a way that would give the Russian-backed separatist regions effective veto power over Ukrainian foreign policy, including any future NATO membership bid. Ukraine and its Western supporters rejected this interpretation. The effect of the Crimea annexation on European security was transformative. NATO, which had been reducing its military presence in Europe and debating its own relevance after the Cold War, was forced to confront the reality that territorial aggression in Europe was possible again. At the 2014 Wales Summit, NATO members committed to spending 2% of GDP on defense, a target most had long ignored. NATO began deploying enhanced forward presence battle groups to the Baltic states and Poland, stationing troops on the territory of its eastern members for the first time. For Finland and Sweden, long committed to a policy of military non-alignment that had kept them outside both Cold War blocs, the Russian aggression in Ukraine was a turning point. Public opinion in both countries shifted dramatically. In Finland, which shares a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia and fought 2 wars against the Soviet Union between 1939 and 1944, the change was particularly striking. A country where NATO membership had consistently polled below 30% suddenly saw majorities in favor. Then, on February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The assault was intended by Russian planners to be a rapid decapitation operation, to seize Kyiv within days, install a compliant government, and present the West with a fait accompli. It failed. Ukrainian forces, armed in part with weapons supplied by NATO members, repelled the attack on Kyiv. The wars settled into a grinding conflict along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers through eastern and southern Ukraine. The invasion produced a seismic shift in European security politics. Within weeks, Finland and Sweden announced their intention to join NATO. After decades of non-alignment, two of the most militarily capable democracies in Europe were applying for membership. Finland formally joined NATO in April 2023. Sweden followed in March 2024, completing an expansion that added the entire northern rim of the Baltic Sea to the alliance's territory. Russia had sought to prevent NATO expansion. Instead, its actions had made NATO larger, more united, and more militarily prepared than at any point since the Cold War. The alliance that had been questioning its own purpose after 1991 had found, in Putin's aggression, a renewed clarity of mission. The eastern flank, stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea, was now the alliance's defining challenge, and the nations along it had made their choice. The door that Gorbachev had hoped would remain closed had been blown open, not by Western ambition alone, but by the very military power that Moscow had used to keep it shut.